Welcome. My name is Philip, and from now on, I'll be the voice guiding you through the stories here on History to Relax. Tonight's episode is a calm journey through time, the story of Great Britain. From the first people who walked its ancient plains to the rise of kings, empires, and modern cities, we'll follow how this island endured, shaped by faith, struggle, invention, and quiet resilience. It's a story of change and continuity, of people who carried hope across thousands of years, leaving echoes that still whisper through the hills and streets today. If you enjoy peaceful journeys like this, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from. It truly helps the channel grow, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now take a deep breath. Let the day slow down. Find a comfortable place to rest, and let your mind drift gently through history, because the story is about to begin. And tonight we'll explore the history of Great Britain together. Part 1. Before the kingdoms dawn over the isles. There is a kind of silence that belongs only to places untouched by time. If you could stand where the Isles of Britain now rise from the sea, before names, before stories, you would hear that silence. It was the hush of wind over empty plains, the sigh of grass brushing against the fur of ancient beasts, the rhythm of waves that had yet to know any harbor or sail. In that far-off age, the islands were not yet islands at all. They were part of the great continent, a cold, endless wilderness stretching into the mist. Herds of mammoth and bison crossed wide valleys where the North Sea now lies. Hunters followed in their shadow, leaving behind faint footprints that would one day rest beneath the waves. They were small bands of wanderers, moving with the seasons, chasing the retreating edge of the ice. The world was still thawing from the grip of the last great ice age. Glaciers shone like silver mountains on the horizon, and rivers thundered beneath walls of ice. Each spring, more of the frozen north surrendered to the sun. Water pooled in the lowlands, carving new paths toward the sea. Slowly, over generations, the land began to break apart, and the island of Britain was born, not in a single moment, but in a long, patient separation. Those first people could never have known the shape their world would take. To them, the ocean was simply another horizon, something shifting, dangerous, and alive. They watched as valleys filled with water, as the ground itself vanished beneath the tides. The earth they had known changed forever, but they adapted. They learned to fish the rivers, to gather shellfish along the growing shores, and to carve small boats from hollowed trunks to follow the currents. Theirs was a quiet existence. The days began with the first light over the hills, and ended beside campfires that cracked and whispered against the wind. They told stories in the flicker of flame, stories that no one wrote down, yet echoes of them remain, carried forward in the mist that would one day call this place Albion, the white land, the land of mist and cliffs. Centuries passed. The forest thickened. Deer and wild boar roamed among oaks and beeches that towered high and close. People began to stay longer in one place. They cleared small patches of land to grow barley and wheat. They shaped clay into pots and learned the rhythm of planting and harvest. Villages began to appear along riversides, nothing more than circles of wooden huts, but they were beginnings, the earliest heartbeat of community on the Isles. At some point, they began to build with stone. Across the rolling downs and wind-swept moors, they raised great circles of standing stones, markers of belief, of ritual, or of wonder. Stonehenge would one day rise among them, its lintels balanced against the sky like a doorway between worlds. No one alive today can say exactly why it was built. Perhaps it measured the sun. Perhaps it honored the dead. Perhaps it was simply a place where the early Britons gathered to feel close to something beyond themselves, to mark their place beneath the heavens. Imagine standing there now, thousands of years ago, as the first light of midsummer dawn spills through the aligned stones. The air is cool and smells of dew. Birds stir among the grasses. A low hum of voices rises as people lift their hands toward the horizon, watching the sun find its ancient path. In that moment, Britain is not yet a kingdom, not yet divided by names or borders. It is a shared space of wonder, where sky and earth and people meet. Over time, new waves of settlers arrived from the mainland, farmers and traders bringing polished tools, pottery, and animals. They followed the same rivers, settled the same fertile lands, and added their languages to the air. The people of the Isles learned to build stronger homes and to shape bronze from copper and tin. Villages turned into small hill forts. Paths became trade routes. The rhythm of life grew more complex, yet it remained tied to the land, to its stones, rains, and seasons. The Bronze Age brought wealth in simple forms: shining ornaments, woven cloth, salt from coastal pools, amber traded from the north. It also brought memory. Burials became grander, marked by mounds that still ripple across the British countryside. Within them, people placed jewelry, tools, and food, gifts for the journey beyond life. Death, like everything else, was folded into the quiet cycle of nature. Generations deepened into centuries. The people watched the stars, charted their movement, and learned to read the patterns of the sky. In the glow of their fires, they must have felt a kind of comfort in that steady, predictable motion, the turning of heavens that mirrored the turning of seasons, the rise and fall of life itself. Then came the age of iron, sharper, stronger, and more restless. Forests fell to axes, and smoke began to curl upward from new settlements built on high ground. Small tribal kingdoms emerged, ruled by chieftains who measured their power in cattle, land, and loyalty. Each tribe had its own gods and stories, its own songs carried on the wind. Yet across all their differences there remained a shared rhythm, a life bound to weather, to the cycle of harvest, and to the mystery of the surrounding sea. That sea was both barrier and bridge. It protected, but it also called. Traders sailed from the coasts of Gaul and Iberia, their boats heavy with goods and rumor. They brought salt and wine, ornaments of gold, and news of distant empires rising beyond the horizon. The people of Britain began to glimpse the wider world, a world that would one day come knocking on their shores with banners, legions, and law. But that was still far away. For now, life was simple, rich in rhythm and repetition. In the hills of what would one day be Wales, smoke rose from hearths inside roundhouses made of wood and thatch. In the north, where the air was colder and the land rougher, people shaped stone tools from riverbeds and hunted red deer through the fog. To the east, across open fields, the earth bore patterns of ditches and banks, early defenses perhaps, or boundaries of sacred ground. Each dawn, mist rolled across the valleys, and each dusk, the fires glowed again. The soundscape of ancient Britain was soft but constant. The call of birds, the creak of trees, the rhythmic beat of water against shore. When storms swept in from the Atlantic, the whole world seemed to shudder under wind and rain. Yet when the skies cleared, the air turned still and bright, carrying the scent of heather, salt, and soil. In that stillness, life endured, not in great leaps, but in steady persistence. The people carved symbols into rock faces, some spirals, some circles, as if to leave a message for the future. They tamed small herds, learned to spin wool, and passed on knowledge through spoken word. The island was becoming more than land. It was turning into a home. There was no Britain yet, no England, Scotland, or Wales. There were only tribes, the Britons, the Picts, the peoples of the Orkneys and the South. Their names would shift like sand over centuries, but they all shared the same horizon, the same gray sea, the same stars that burned above the high hills and moors. If you could walk through one of their villages at twilight, You might hear laughter mingled with the clatter of wooden bowls, the hiss of meat roasting over flame, the bark of dogs outside the huts. You might see children playing near the fire, their faces lit with that same amber glow that would warm every generation after them. The past was not yet written, but the story had begun, not with kings or battles, but with families gathering close against the Ned. As centuries rolled onward, these quiet beginnings would lay the foundation for everything that came after. From the hum of bees over wild meadows to the ring of hammers shaping bronze, the land itself was teaching its people endurance. It was shaping their patience, their connection to soil and sea, qualities that would outlast empires and still whisper through the British character thousands of years later. In the end, this first chapter of Britain's story is not one of conquest or invention. It is one of belonging, of people learning to listen to the land and to one another. Their world was fragile but whole, small but complete. And though they could never have known it, the stones they raised and the paths they walked would echo far into the future, calling softly through time. When the Romans finally came, they would see these same hills, these same rivers, and believe they were discovering something new. But the truth is simpler, older, and quieter. Britain had been alive long before they arrived, breathing, growing, waiting. It waited through ice and storm. It waited through centuries of dawns over empty fields. And now, as the mists part and the sea winds rise, the island stands ready for its next chapter, the age of empire, of walls and soldiers, and the long shadow of Rome. Part 2. The Coming of Rome. The sea that once protected the island would one day betray it. For centuries, the waves around Britain had been a boundary, the soft, breathing edge of a world apart. But as ships began to cross those waters more often, that isolation started to fade. Across the Channel, in the lands we now call France, a great power had risen, disciplined, relentless, and curious. Its soldiers marched in perfect step, its banners bright with eagles and gold. The name whispered along the coasts was Rome. At first, the people of Britain knew of the Romans only through rumor and trade. Strange coins appeared in their markets, stamped with the faces of foreign leaders. Merchants brought stories of roads that stretched for miles, of cities made of stone and light, and of armies that could cross mountains. The Britons traded tin, wool, and hides for glass, wine, and pottery, marveling at the beauty of things made far beyond their shores. Then, one summer, sails appeared on the horizon. It was the year 55 BCE, when Julius Caesar, already famous for his conquest of Gaul, looked across the narrow strait and saw opportunity. His first invasion was small, more of an exploration than a conquest. His ships landed on the southern beaches, near the chalk cliffs of Kent. There he met fierce resistance. Warriors with painted bodies and chariots drawn by small, fast horses rushed to meet the newcomers. Their cries echoed over the surf as iron clashed with bronze. Caesar stayed only a short time. The storms of the Channel, the unfamiliar terrain, and the determination of the Britons forced him to withdraw. But the Romans had seen enough. They knew this island was rich in resources and that its people, though brave, were divided. In time they would return, stronger, more prepared, and ready to stay. Almost a century passed before they came again. By then, Rome's power had stretched across much of the known world. The legions had subdued Gaul, marched into Spain, and crossed the deserts of Africa. And in the year 43 CE, under Emperor Claudius, the order was given: Britain would become part of the empire. This time there was no hesitation. 4 legions, tens of thousands of trained soldiers, crossed the sea, landing near the same southern shores. They advanced with precision, building camps each night surrounded by ditches and ramparts. Their shields gleamed in the weak British sunlight. Their sandals pressed perfect lines into the mud. The tribes who opposed them fought bravely, but Rome moved like a machine, organized, silent, and unstoppable. One by one, the great tribal leaders were defeated or forced to surrender. The Romans built their first fort at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, and declared it the capital of their new province, Britannia. Around it, the land began to change. Wooden huts gave way to stone buildings. Straight roads sliced through the countryside, linking forts to ports and cities. Bridges spanned rivers that had once marked tribal boundaries. The Roman idea of order began to take hold. They built baths and temples, introduced written records, and laid out towns in perfect squares. Farmers learned new methods of cultivation. Merchants prospered as trade flowed through Roman ports. Latin words began to mingle with Celtic speech. The air filled with the sounds of hammers, wagons, and voices, the noise of civilization spreading. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. In the east of Britain, a proud queen named Boudica rose in defiance. Her husband, a king allied with Rome, had died and his lands were seized by Roman officials. When she protested, she was beaten, and her daughters were humiliated. That cruelty lit a fire that would burn across the province. Boudica called the tribes to arms. From Norfolk to the Midlands, warriors gathered beneath her banner, men and women alike, painted and fierce. They marched on the Roman towns, their fury unstoppable. Camulodunum fell first. Londinium, London, was next. The city burned, its streets filled with smoke and ash. For a moment, it seemed as if Rome might lose its newest province to the will of the islanders. But Rome did not yield easily. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped his forces and met Boudica's army on open ground. The Romans formed their tight defensive wall, shields locked, spears ready. The Britons charged in waves, but the discipline of the legions broke them. By the end of the day, the field was silent. Boudica's rebellion had been crushed. The queen herself disappeared from history. Some say she drank poison rather than be captured, but her defiance would echo for centuries as a symbol of Britain's spirit. After her fall, Roman rule hardened but also deepened. Fortresses became towns. Towns became cities. The Romans built amphitheaters and temples, villas with mosaic floors, and public baths where the wealthy gathered to talk and relax. In the north, they raised an astonishing wall, Hadrian's Wall, stretching across the narrowest part of the island, from sea to sea. It was both a defense and a statement, this far and no farther. Beyond the wall, the tribes of Caledonia, the ancestors of the Scots, remained free. Life in Roman Britain settled into a rhythm. Soldiers patrolled the roads, merchants traded in markets, farmers tilled the soil. Latin became the language of law and record, but in the countryside the old Celtic tongue endured. Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, watched over the towns, while local deities still ruled the rivers and groves. In many places the two worlds blended. Shrines appeared where Roman stone met native spirit, a quiet merging of belief and custom. For nearly 400 years, Britain was part of the Roman world. Children born here grew up thinking of themselves as Roman citizens. They wore togas, studied Latin, and prayed to the same gods as those in distant Rome. Yet beneath the surface, the land still remembered its older ways. The forests and hills kept their mysteries untouched by the march of empire. As time went on, the empire itself began to falter. The legions were stretched thin, called away to defend distant borders. Rome grew weaker, troubled by civil wars and the pressure of tribes beyond its frontiers. The great city that had ruled the world began to crumble from within. In Britain, the signs were subtle at first. Taxes left uncollected, roads untended, outposts silent. Then came the withdrawals. One by one, the legions were recalled to the continent. The soldiers who had guarded the towns and kept the peace vanished. The great machine of empire, once so powerful, began to rust. For those who remained, life grew uncertain again. Without the legions, raiders from across the sea, Saxons, Picts, and Scots began to test the undefended coasts. The towns that had flourished under Roman order became fragile. Roofs fell in, markets emptied, and the steady beat of the empire faded into silence. And yet, in that silence, something older began to stir. The people adapted, as they always had. They took what Rome had left, the roads, the walls, the knowledge, and made it their own. Latin words mixed with native speech. Roman villas became fortresses or farms. Christianity, which had quietly taken root in the later centuries of empire, began to spread more freely among the people, bringing with it a new sense of hope and belonging. By the early 5th century, the last Roman governor departed, taking with him the remnants of imperial authority. Britain was alone again, no longer a province, not yet a kingdom. The island stood on the edge of another transformation. It is tempting to see the end of Roman Britain as a collapse, but in truth it was more like the turning of a page. The land itself endured, patient as always. Fields returned to wild grass. Roads grew quiet. In the ruins of Roman baths and temples, wildflowers took root. The people who walked among them lived simpler lives once more, tending sheep, planting crops, and keeping the old fires burning through the long winters. And though Rome was gone, its shadow lingered, in the stones of its roads, in the shape of its towns, in the memories of order and connection it had left behind. Those traces would never fade completely. They would lie waiting, like embers beneath ash, ready to flare again when new kingdoms rose. For now, Britain drifted into what later ages would call the Dark Ages, though there was nothing truly dark about them. The light was simply smaller, more local, flickering in monasteries, in hearths, and in the hearts of the people who refused to let their land fall silent. The Romans had come and gone. Their empire had built walls, paved roads, and brought the gift of words and law. But Britain remained what it had always been, an island of persistence, of mist and endurance, of people shaped more by the rhythm of the earth than the will of emperors. The legions may have marched away, but the story was far from over. Beyond the ruins and the fading Latin inscriptions, new voices were rising, voices that spoke of Saxons and saints, of kings and faith, of a land rediscovering itself in the long shadow of empire. And as the centuries turned again, the island that had once bowed to Rome would begin, quietly, to become its own. Part 3. The Fall of Rome and the Age of Shadows. When the last Roman ships disappeared beyond the southern horizon, Britain was left in a quiet unlike any it had known before. For almost 400 years, the legions had brought rhythm and structure. Their roads cut through wilderness, their laws bound the people and shared rule, their coins carried the emperor's face into every corner of the island. And then, almost suddenly, it was gone. The empire had retreated across the sea, its power spent. The people of Britain were alone again, not by choice but by the slow unraveling of something too vast to hold together. The villas and bathhouses that had once buzzed with life fell silent. Roofs sagged beneath rain and moss. Roads that had carried soldiers and merchants began to vanish beneath grass and creeping ivy. In the towns, the markets thinned, the traders disappeared, and the voice of Latin, once the sound of order, faded from daily speech. A colder, older language began to rise again, shaped by the hills and rivers that had always been there. It was not a single collapse, but a long dimming. One generation still remembered the empire's brightness, the next only heard of it as a story. The Roman gods, whose temples had stood proudly on hilltops, lost their worshippers. Christianity, which had spread quietly through the province during the empire's final centuries, became the main thread of hope. Across the island, small communities of monks and nuns gathered in wooden halls and stone cells, keeping the faith alive through prayer, scripture, and song. Their voices were soft but steady, a rhythm against the uncertainty that surrounded them. Outside their walls, the land was changing again. From the north came the Picts, fierce and painted, crossing the old Roman lines. From across the sea, in narrow boats with curved hulls, came the Scots from Ireland. And from the east, riding the tides of the North Sea, came the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, seafaring tribes from the lowlands of what is now Germany and Denmark. They did not come as conquerors at first, but as mercenaries, hired by British leaders who sought protection from northern raiders. Yet the mercenaries soon realized that the land they guarded was rich, its soil dark and fertile, its rivers deep. And so they stayed. Their numbers grew, their settlements spread, and slowly the newcomers began to shape the island's destiny. The native Britons, descended from Celts and Roman citizens alike, retreated westward, into the highlands of Wales, into Cornwall, into the hills of Cumbria. There they built small kingdoms of their own, preserving their language, their songs, and their pride. They called themselves Cymri, the companions, the people of the land. Their poets sang of heroes and lost glories, of a time before the strangers came. From these songs, the first legends of Arthur would one day rise, the shadow of a king who fought to keep the old Britain alive. But in the east and south, the newcomers flourished. They built wooden halls instead of stone towns. They worshipped not in temples, but in groves, beneath the open sky, offering to gods of thunder and war. Their speech was harsh and rhythmic, filled with short, solid words, the beginnings of what would become the English tongue. This was a time of fragmentation, yet also of transformation. Old ways and new beliefs mingled. Christianity retreated with the Britons but would return again in the centuries ahead, carried back across the sea by monks from Ireland and missionaries from Rome. In the meantime, the island was a patchwork of tribes and warlords, each ruling their own small realm, each fighting for survival. The historians of later ages would call this period the Dark Ages. But the darkness was not emptiness. It was a night sky filled with small lights, scattered but alive. The great cities of the Romans had fallen, but in quiet valleys and island monasteries, knowledge still flickered. Monks copied sacred texts by candlelight. Farmers learned to work the soil without Roman machines. Blacksmiths forged simple tools and weapons, passing their craft from father to son. If you could walk through Britain then, you would find a land of contrasts, wild and quiet, broken yet enduring. Forests reclaimed the ruins of Roman villas. Wolves prowled near abandoned roads. The people lived close to the land again, measuring time not by emperors' reigns but by the turning of the seasons. In the west, Christian monasteries grew strong in places like Iona and Wales. There saints such as Patrick, David, and Columba spread faith through word and deed. Their message was gentle, yet persistent, that even in the ruins of empire, light could be kept alive. They built their communities by hand, low stone walls, simple chapels, fields carved from wilderness. Their days were marked by prayer, labor, and silence. At dawn, bells rang out over misty shores, calling the faithful to chant in voices that mingled with the cries of seabirds. In the east, the pagan kingdoms of the Saxons expanded. Kent, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, each carved its own domain, each dreaming of dominance. Their kings ruled from wooden halls filled with smoke and song, feasting on mead as bards sang of ancestors and valor. Life was harsh, but not joyless. In the glow of the firelight, laughter and courage became their form of endurance. Between these two worlds, the Christian and the pagan Britons stood divided but alive. The rivers that once carried Roman trade now marked boundaries of faith and language. Yet the island's people, in all their diversity, shared one truth: survival. They endured winters of hunger and raids, summers of toil and rebuilding. They buried their dead and carried on. In the far north, Among the rugged cliffs of Scotland, the Picts carved symbols into stones, spirals, beasts, and warriors locked in eternal struggle. In Ireland, poets recited sagas of heroes who crossed seas and defied fate. And in England, buried beneath mounds of earth, kings were laid to rest with their treasures, swords, shields, and ornaments of gold. One such burial at Sutton, who would one day reveal the wealth and artistry of this so-called Dark Age, showing that even in isolation, beauty still thrived. As centuries passed, the lines between tribes blurred. Intermarriage, trade, and shared struggle began to weave a fragile unity. Pagan kings sent their children to be baptized. Monks taught the newcomers to read Latin scripture. In time, the two halves of the island, pagan and Christian, foreign and native, began to merge into something new. Still, the landscape kept its ancient silence. In the mist that rolled over the fens, it was easy to imagine ghosts of the old empire, a broken milestone half buried in moss, a fragment of marble glinting in the mud, a memory of what had been. Yet the people did not mourn endlessly. They built anew. Theirs was not a world of loss, but of renewal, quieter, humbler, and more human. By the 7th century, the first sparks of culture and learning began to glow again. Monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow became centers of art and study. Illuminated manuscripts, their pages glowing with gold and color, told stories of faith and hope. The Book of Kells, created in the Irish tradition, shone like a lantern of the spirit, a bridge between old artistry and new devotion. In these sacred halls, the monks preserved not only religion, but fragments of ancient wisdom, the writings of Rome, the sciences of Greece, the histories of nations now fallen. They became the quiet keepers of memory in an age that otherwise forgot. And outside their walls, the people continued their slow, unending rhythm, tending fields, building huts, mending nets, raising children. Life was simpler, but it had meaning. Each hearth that glowed in the night was a statement against oblivion. Each prayer, each story, was a thread in the fabric of survival. The Age of Shadows was not a time of despair, but a time of patience. The world had dimmed, yet it waited, like soil in winter, for the return of spring. From this period of stillness would rise a new kind of Britain, one no longer Roman, but distinctly its own. The next centuries would see missionaries crossing the sea once more, not as conquerors, but as teachers. They would bring faith to the Saxon kings, write new laws, and begin the long weaving of a nation. And through that slow transformation, the island would rediscover its voice, a blend of tongues and traditions, faiths and memories that would one day become England. But for now, as the last fires of Roman civilization faded into ash, the island rested beneath its gray sky. Fields lay quiet, monasteries hummed with prayer, and the sea whispered along its endless shores. The darkness was deep, yes, but within it the seeds of a new dawn had already been planted. And soon, from that dawn, a new power would rise, one carried not by Rome's legions but by sails from the north, and the echo of hammers in the halls of kings. Part 4. The Vikings and the Forging of England. For a time, peace held across the island. The small kingdoms that had emerged from the ruins of Rome, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, lived in uneasy balance. Each ruled by its own king, each tied to its own river valleys, each speaking its own form of the growing English tongue. They fought, but they also traded. They built churches and monasteries. They plowed the fields, carved crosses from stone, and sang hymns in halls of oak. Britain was finding its rhythm again, fragile but steady. Then from the sea came the sound of oars. It began with whispers, carried on the wind from the coasts of Ireland and the Western Isles, tales of long, narrow ships with carved prows and striped sails cutting through the mist like predators. They came swiftly, almost silently, their warriors stepping onto the beaches before anyone knew they had arrived. The first raids were small, lightning strikes on monasteries and villages. In the year 793, the Abbey of Lindisfarne fell. The monks who had tended that sacred island for generations heard the sea before they saw it. The wind shifted, the gulls scattered, and the horizon filled with ships. The raiders came ashore shouting strange words. They carried axes and round shields painted in bright colors. The monks had no weapons, only faith. The church bells that once called to prayer rang one last time before falling silent. The world of learning and peace that had survived from the Roman twilight was suddenly broken. The story of Lindisfarne spread quickly. Other abbeys followed: Jarrow, Iona, the monasteries along the Irish Sea. Places of worship and knowledge became targets not because of hatred of faith, but because of the silver, gold, and treasure kept within their walls. The Vikings, as the people came to call them, were not only warriors, they were explorers, traders, and farmers seeking land and wealth in a crowded northern world. At first, the raids came and went with the seasons. They struck in summer, when the seas were calmer, and vanished before winter's storms. But over time, the attacks became settlements. The Vikings began to stay. Their longships brought not only warriors but families, men, women, and children, who built homes along the coasts and rivers. They settled in the north and east, carving out territories that would become known as the Danelaw, the land ruled by Danish law. York, once the Roman city of Eboracum, became Jorvik, a thriving Norse town filled with traders, craftsmen, and ships from across the seas. The sound of the marketplace mixed Old Norse with Old English, two languages blending like the tides. For the English kingdoms, this new reality was terrifying. Northumbria and East Anglia fell quickly. Mercia wavered. Only in the south, in the kingdom of Wessex, did resistance harden. There ruled a young king, thoughtful, patient, and determined, whose name would echo through every century that followed: Alfred. Alfred of Wessex came to power in a time of crisis. Viking armies, sometimes numbering thousands, moved through the countryside, burning villages and taking fortresses. His people were weary, his lands divided, and yet Alfred refused to surrender. He believed that England could endure, not as scattered kingdoms, but as one. When the great Viking host swept through the south, Alfred was forced to flee into the marshlands of Somerset. There, hidden among the reeds and fog, he gathered loyal men and planned his return. Legend tells that in his exile he once burned a peasant woman's cakes while lost in thought, a small human moment that revealed the weight of his burden. From those marshes, Alfred rebuilt his strength. In 878, he met the Viking leader Guthrum in battle at Edington. The fighting was fierce and close, the air thick with the smell of mud and iron. By the end of the day, Alfred's shield wall held. Guthrum's forces broke. The victory was small by Roman measure, but for the English it was everything. Afterward, Alfred made peace with Guthrum, not through vengeance, but through wisdom. The Viking leader accepted baptism, and the two agreed to divide the land. Wessex and the west would remain under Alfred's rule, the east would belong to the Danelaw. It was a fragile peace, but it marked a beginning. In the years that followed, Alfred proved himself more than a warrior. He was a builder, a teacher, and a dreamer. He strengthened his defenses, creating a network of fortified towns called burhs, safe havens against future raids. He built a navy, small but fast, to guard the coasts, and he encouraged learning, inviting scholars from across Europe to his court. He believed that knowledge was as vital to survival as the sword. Under Alfred's guidance, the English language began to take written form. Chronicles were kept, stories of kings, battles, and miracles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was born, a record of the island's past and present that would shape its identity for generations. In quiet script by candlelight, monks wrote down the story of a people who refused to vanish. Even in war, life went on. Fields were plowed, markets reopened, children learned to read. The memory of chaos slowly gave way to a sense of purpose. Alfred called himself not merely King of Wessex but King of the Anglo-Saxons, the first to imagine a united England. After his death, his children and grandchildren continued his work. His daughter Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, ruled with courage and intelligence, leading armies and rebuilding towns. His grandson Athelstan would one day succeed where even Alfred had not. He would unite the whole of England under one crown. By the 10th century, the idea of England, England, the land of the English, was no longer just a dream. The old tribal lines were fading. Churches rose again where once had stood pagan halls. The laws of Alfred and his descendants bound the people together, and the language of the island, a blend of Saxon, Norse, and Celtic, began to sound more familiar to modern ears. Still, the sea never stopped bringing change. More Viking ships came, seeking not conquest but trade. Markets thrived in towns like York, Lincoln, and Norwich. Silver coins minted in England bore the names of both English and Norse rulers, symbols of uneasy cooperation. The two cultures intertwined. A century earlier, they had met in fire and blood. Now they shared tools, stories, and words. The English learned shipbuilding and navigation from the Norse. The Norse learned farming and governance from the English. Intermarriage was common. A new generation grew up speaking both tongues, neither wholly one nor the other. What began as invasion had become transformation, but the peace was never permanent. In the late 10th century, new waves of Vikings arrived from Denmark and Norway, stronger and more ambitious than before. Their raids were larger, their fleets greater, their leaders more ruthless. Once again, the coast burned. Villages emptied. Kings paid heavy sums of silver Danegeld to buy temporary peace. Amid this turmoil rose another great figure, King Knut of Denmark, who in 1016 became ruler of both England and his Scandinavian homeland. Though a foreigner, Knut ruled with fairness and insight. Under his reign, the kingdom prospered. He supported the church, maintained law and order, and treated English and Dane alike with justice. For a brief time, the North Sea became the heart of one realm, binding Scandinavia and England under one crown. Knut's empire did not last long after his death, but his rule left a mark. It proved that the island could no longer be isolated, that the sea connected as much as it divided. The English crown that followed would never forget that truth. As the 11th century dawned, England stood stronger and more unified than ever before. Its kings ruled from stone halls, its towns bustled with trade, and its faith was firmly Christian once more. Yet beyond the horizon another storm was gathering, a Norman duke across the Channel, watching, waiting, and dreaming of conquest. The Viking Age, with all its raids, courage, and mingling of cultures, had forged the core of what England would become. It had taught the island to endure, to rebuild, and to absorb what came from the sea rather than be broken by it. From that crucible of conflict and adaptation, a new identity had emerged, proud, resilient, and restless. Soon, the island would face one more invasion. One that would not only reshape its rulers, but its language, its architecture, and its destiny. The sails on the horizon would no longer belong to Vikings, but to Normans, descendants of those same northern raiders now transformed by time and by France. The next chapter of Britain's story would open with a single date whispered across centuries, 1066, and the shadow of a new kind of king. Part 5. The Norman Tide. The wind that had once carried Viking ships toward England would in time carry another fleet, one even larger, heavier, and more disciplined. The sea had always been the island's wall and its mirror. What came across it brought either ruin or renewal, and in the year 1066 both would arrive together. By the middle of the 11th century, England was a kingdom at last, rich, organized, and proud. The long age of raids was fading into memory. Stone churches stood where wooden halls once burned. Monasteries flourished, and fields stretched in orderly lines across the countryside. A single crown ruled from Winchester, its authority reaching from the northern moors to the southern coast. That crown belonged to Edward the Confessor, a quiet and deeply pious king. He had no children, and his gentle rule masked a storm building beneath the surface. For years he had lived in Normandy, across the sea in northern France, before becoming king. Many of his closest advisors were Norman. When Edward died in January of 1066, he left behind no heir, only uncertainty. 3 men claimed the throne: Harold Godwinson, England's powerful earl and the man chosen by the English council; Harold Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, who claimed an ancient promise of inheritance; and Duke William of Normandy, who swore that Edward had once named him successor. The island that had survived centuries of invasion would now be tested again, not by wandering raiders but by kings. Harold Godwinson was crowned quickly, hoping to secure his claim before foreign sails appeared. His people celebrated with feasts and firelight, but their joy was short-lived. In late summer the first threat came from the north. Harold Hardrada, the great Norwegian, landed near York with a massive fleet. His warriors marched inland, their banners fluttering like fire against the gray sky. Harold Godwinson marched north to meet them. The two armies clashed at Stamford Bridge, a battle fierce and sudden. The English fought with shields and spears, the Norwegians with axes and fury. When it was over, the field was silent, littered with armor and ash. Hardrada lay dead, struck down by an arrow through the throat. His dream of a Viking England died with him, but there was no time for rest. Even as Harold's men buried their fallen, news came that Duke William had crossed the Channel and landed on the southern coast at Pevensey. The Norman tide had come. The march south was brutal. Harold's army, already exhausted, moved as fast as it could. They reached the hills near Hastings, where William's men waited, disciplined soldiers, mounted knights, and archers in steel helms. The two forces faced each other on a crisp October morning, each knowing that the day ahead would decide the island's fate. The battle began with the sound of horns and arrows cutting through the air. The English formed their famous shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, unyielding. The Normans charged uphill again and again, their horses straining against the slope. For hours, neither side gave ground. Then came a moment, perhaps a feigned retreat, perhaps confusion, when part of Harold's line broke. The Normans seized the chance, circling back with deadly precision. By sunset, the hill was theirs. Harold Godwinson had fallen, struck, some said, by an arrow through the eye. The sun set red over the field, and England's last Saxon king was gone. Duke William stood victorious. Within months, he would be crowned William I, known to history as William the Conqueror. The conquest that followed was unlike any before. The Normans did not come to plunder and leave. They came to rule. William divided the land among his followers, replacing the old English nobility with Norman lords. Castles rose across the landscape, at first of wood, later of stone, strongholds of authority where none had stood before. The great white walls of the Tower of London began to rise, a new symbol of power gazing over the Thames. For the common people, life changed slowly, but deeply. The language of the rulers was French, the tongue of the people remained English. In courts and charters, French words crept into the Old Saxon speech, blending over time into something new, the beginning of modern English. Everywhere, the island began to look different. Roman ruins, Saxon halls, and Viking villages gave way to the architecture of Normandy. Soaring arches, thick stone keeps, and abbeys that caught the morning light in tall windows of colored glass. The Normans brought more than conquest, they brought administration, law, and ambition. William ordered a survey of everything he ruled, every field, forest, cow, and cottage. His scribes wrote it all in Latin, calling it the Doomsday Book. It was the first great census of England, a mirror of the nation's wealth and reach. Even today, the names recorded there, villages, rivers, and families, formed the backbone of the country's memory. Yet the Norman conquest was not without pain. Many English families lost their lands and titles. Resistance flickered in the north, where rebels fought from forests and moors. William answered with fire. Whole towns were burned, fields destroyed, and people scattered. The harrying of the north left scars that would linger for generations. Still, as decades passed, a strange harmony took shape. The children of Norman lords and English mothers grew up speaking both tongues. The church, strengthened by reform, became the unifying thread between conqueror and conquered. Stone monasteries rose from the ashes of old wooden ones, filled with monks who prayed for both the living and the dead, Saxon and Norman alike. By the 12th century, the distinction between them began to blur. A New England was emerging, feudal, ordered and tied more closely than ever to the continent. Trade flourished. Markets grew around castles and abbeys. The roads that once led to battle now carried pilgrims, merchants, and farmers. The Normans also looked outward. Their descendants crossed the sea to Ireland, to Wales, to Scotland, carrying their towers, their churches, and their hunger for expansion. The idea of England was no longer confined to a patch of land. It was becoming a force that would shape the whole of the British Isles. And through all this, the memory of 1066 never faded. It was the moment when the island's course shifted, when every name, every word, every law began to change. The people still spoke English, but it was a softer, richer tongue now, woven with French and Latin. Their world was built on layers, Celtic roots, Roman roads, Saxon fields, Norman stone. If you stood then on a high hill at dusk, you might see what England had become. To the west, forests glowed gold in the fading light. To the east, new towns shimmered beside rivers, their roofs of tile and slate catching the last warmth of day. In the distance, the spire of a Norman church rose above the fields, solid, enduring, and still. The age of the sword was giving way to the age of order, but the island, restless as ever, would not sleep for long. The centuries ahead would bring crusades, reforms, and the long, uneasy dance between crown and faith. A story of kings who dreamed of glory and of people who dreamed of freedom. For now, the Normans held their new kingdom firmly. Yet beneath their stone walls and carved chapels, the English heart still beat, patient, quiet, waiting once again for its turn to rise. Part 6. Crown and Church. In the centuries after the Norman conquest, England settled into a strange new rhythm, one of authority and devotion, of splendor and strain. The clash of swords had quieted, but the quiet did not bring peace of spirit. It was replaced by the slow tension between two powers that both claimed divine right, the crown and the church. The Normans had reshaped the land. They built stone castles that rose like mountains above valleys and rivers. Their keeps and towers watched over every shire and village. Beneath their shadow, fields spread in neat lines, tilled by peasants who now owed service to their lords. The old Saxon freedoms had been replaced by feudal order, a chain of loyalty stretching from the humblest farmer to the king himself. And above even the king stood God, or at least those who claimed to speak for him. The church had grown powerful. Monasteries dotted the landscape, small worlds of prayer and labor, where monks rose before dawn to chant by candlelight. Cathedrals began to rise, vast and intricate, their arches like frozen waves of stone. Builders worked for decades, even lifetimes, to raise them skyward. In their carvings and stained glass, every sermon and story took shape for a people who could not yet read. The air inside a cathedral was cool and rich with incense. The sound of the choir seemed to hang in the vault like light itself. To step inside was to leave behind the world of mud and hunger, and to feel, if only for a moment, the weight of heaven above. Kings were crowned beneath those vaults, anointed with oil and blessed with holy words. They ruled not only by sword, but by sanctity, for without the Church's blessing, no crown could truly endure. Yet that blessing came with chains of its own. The same Church that crowned kings also reminded them that their power was never absolute. William the Conqueror's sons learned this quickly. His successor, William Rufus, quarreled endlessly with churchmen, favoring wealth and war over faith. His reign ended suddenly, a hunting accident, they said, though some whispered that an arrow found him by design. His brother Henry took the crown, promising good rule and justice. To bind the realm together, he issued a charter, a forerunner of the rights that would one day define English liberty. Henry's daughter, Matilda, would one day fight for that same crown. Her struggle against her cousin Stephen plunged the land into chaos, a period remembered simply as the Anarchy. Castles burned, famine spread, and for nearly 20 years England was torn between rival rulers. In the end, peace came only when Stephen named Matilda's son, Henry, as heir. That son would be Henry II, one of the most capable and restless kings to ever rule the island. Henry believed that order was everything. He reformed law, established royal courts, and sent judges to every corner of his realm. For the first time, justice became something that came from the king, not from the local lord. The idea of common law, the shared foundation of fairness, began to take root, but Henry's hunger for control brought him into conflict with another man, his old friend, Thomas Becket. When Henry made Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury, he expected loyalty. Instead, he found resistance. Becket defended the Church's right to judge its own, refusing to let royal power overshadow divine authority. Their friendship became rivalry, and rivalry became rage. In the winter of 1170, 4 knights rode to Canterbury, believing they carried out the king's unspoken will. Inside the great cathedral, they found Becket praying before the altar. The blows fell quickly. When it was done, the archbishop lay dead in a pool of blood. His life ended on holy ground. The shock spread through all of Europe. A king's word, even spoken in anger, had led to murder within the church. Henry's triumph turned to torment. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, dressed in sackcloth, submitting himself to penance. Becket was declared a saint, his tomb a place of pilgrimage for generations. The lesson was written in stone: no crown, however powerful, stood above conscience. From that point on, the dance between crown and church became the heartbeat of England's story. Each king sought to hold the reins of power more tightly, and each generation of churchmen sought to remind them that the soul could never be ruled by law alone. Under Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, England's gaze turned outward once more. Richard was a warrior king, drawn by the dream of crusade. He spent little time in his own land, leading armies across seas and deserts to the walls of Jerusalem. His courage became legend, though his absence left England strained. When he was captured and held for ransom, his people paid dearly for his release. While Richard fought in the east, his younger brother John waited in the shadows. When he became king, he inherited not the glory of his brother, but the debts of his ambition. John's reign was troubled from the start, marked by loss, rebellion, and mistrust. The church excommunicated him after he defied the Pope's will. His nobles turned against him when he demanded too much and gave too little. The crisis reached its peak in 1215 on a meadow beside the Thames at Runnymede. There, beneath grey skies and fluttering banners, the king faced his barons and their demands for justice. The document they forced him to seal would echo through every century to come. It was called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Its words were simple, but profound. Even the king, it declared, must obey the law. No man could be imprisoned without reason. The rights of the church and the people were to be respected. John sealed it with anger, not conviction, but the seal held. The balance of power had shifted. The divine right of kings had met its first true limit, set down not by rebellion but by ink. In the years that followed, the church continued to grow in influence. Cathedrals in Canterbury, Lincoln, and Salisbury reached toward heaven. Pilgrims traveled from every corner of the realm, following the road to holy shrines. Monks illuminated books that shimmered with gold leaf, turning words into prayer. Yet not all was peace. The same faith that built hospitals and schools also kindled war. Crusades called English knights back to the Holy Land. Taxes were raised, promises made, and lives lost in distant sands. The ideals of glory often met the reality of hunger and disease. Still, the spirit of devotion endured, not in the triumphs of kings, but in the small kindnesses of common life. In village churches, bells marked the hours of prayer. The seasons were tied to feast days and harvests, each part of the year a reflection of faith. A child's baptism, a wedding, a funeral, all were moments under the church's hand. Its presence was everywhere, in the fields blessed before planting, in the candles lit for the dead, in the soft sound of Latin chants drifting through open doors. And through it all, the crown watched. Kings needed the church's blessing to rule, but feared its power to command hearts. The tension never faded. It only changed form with each generation. By the 13th century, Parliament had begun to take shape, first as a gathering of nobles and bishops, later including representatives of towns and shires. The idea of shared council was growing, born from the same soil as the Magna Carta. England was learning that power could be divided, not easily, but necessarily. From conquest had come kingdom. From kingdom had come law. And from law would one day come liberty. But that was still far in the future. For now, the balance between crown and church held, uneasy, sacred, and fragile. Kings would pray for God's favor, and the clergy would pray for the souls of kings. Both would need each other more than they could ever admit. As the 13th century closed, the great cathedrals stood completed, towers of stone that still pierced the English sky. Beneath them, peasants worked the same earth their ancestors had plowed for centuries. The rhythm of bells, seasons, and faith marked the passing of days. England had been conquered, divided, and reformed. Yet its heart, its quiet endurance had never changed, and soon that endurance would be tested again. For beyond its shores, 100 years of war waited to begin. Part 7. Plague, Peasants, and Rebellion. By the middle of the 14th century, England was a land of contrasts. In the great cities, cathedrals soared, their bells echoing over crowded streets filled with merchants, beggars, and the smell of smoke and spice. In the countryside, peasants still worked the same narrow strips of land their ancestors had tended for generations. The nobles hunted, feasted, and fought for favor, while monks kept watch over their cloistered gardens, riding by candlelight in the long winters. To those who lived then, it must have seemed as if the world had reached a kind of balance, imperfect, yet stable. The church guided the soul, the crown guarded the realm, and the land fed those strong enough to work it. But beneath that calm surface, cracks were forming, and from those cracks the medieval world would begin to break apart. It started with hunger. The first decades of the 1300s brought years of rain. Heavy, endless rain that turned fields to swamps and spoiled grain before it could ripen. Crops failed, livestock starved, and villages went without bread. The Great Famine, as it would later be called, swept through England and much of Europe alike. People sold what they had to buy food. Families boiled weeds and bark to survive. The poor dug shallow graves, and the priests could no longer keep up with the dead. When the rains finally stopped, the survivors returned to their fields thinner, harder, and changed. They had seen how fragile life was, how close starvation lay behind the veil of order. Yet even as the skies cleared, a darker shadow gathered on the horizon, something unseen, unstoppable, and beyond the reach of prayer. It came from the east. From the ports of Italy and France carried on ships, and in the breath of travelers it spread like smoke across the continent. By the time it reached the southern coasts of England in 1348, it already had a name whispered in dread, the Black Death. At first, no one understood what it was. A strange fever, a swelling under the arms or at the groin, a pain that turned to delirium, and then silence. It moved faster than thought, leaving towns hollow and fields untended. Entire families vanished within days. The bells that once marked the hours of prayer now tolled endlessly for the dead. Chroniclers wrote that in London the carts never stopped. Day and night they rolled through narrow streets, piled high with bodies covered in rags and straw. Graves were dug not for one, but for hundreds. The stench of lime and decay hung over every churchyard. No one could explain why some lived and others died. Even the priests, who had stood unshaken through famine and war, began to fear the sacraments themselves, for the act of blessing the dying was enough to seal one's own fate. In the countryside, villages disappeared altogether. In some places, only the church tower remained to mark where people had once lived. The plague did not care for status. Kings, monks, merchants, and peasants fell alike. The rich fled to their manors, but the sickness followed. The poor prayed harder, but heaven seemed distant, and yet from this darkness something unexpected began to grow. When the plague finally ebbed, leaving perhaps half the population gone, those who survived found themselves in a changed world. There were fewer hands to work the land, fewer mouths to feed, and for the first time, the peasants held the kind of power they had never known. Landlords, desperate for labor, began offering higher wages. Fields that had once been crowded now lay open to new tenants. The rigid order of feudal life, where a man owed his lord's service in exchange for safety, began to loosen. The people had seen how fragile lords and kings truly were. They had seen that death came for all, and that power could vanish as easily as breath. But not everyone welcomed the change. The nobles in Parliament tried to freeze wages by law, to hold the old order in place. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, demanded that no worker take more pay than before the plague. To the people who had just survived years of death and hunger, it was an insult, a denial of the new life they had earned through endurance. Discontent grew slowly, then all at once. In 1381, it erupted. It began in the villages of Essex and Kent, when royal officials arrived to collect a new poll tax, a fee on every man, woman, and child, regardless of wealth. The people had nothing left to give. In anger, they rose. They refused to pay, chased the collectors from their towns, and gathered in thousands, marching toward London. At their head were men of conviction, like Wat Tyler, a craftsman with a clear voice and a sense of justice, and John Ball, a radical priest who preached that all men were made equal in the eyes of God. When Adam delved and Eve span, he said, "Who was then the gentleman?" The words caught fire in the minds of the poor. Tens of thousands marched under banners of St. George, their voices echoing across the countryside. They tore down manorial records, burned tax offices, and demanded the end of serfdom itself. When they reached London, the city gates opened to them, not from fear, but from sympathy. Even within the capital, many believed their cause was just. The rebels entered the city, calling for justice and reform. For a brief, breathless moment, it seemed that the world might truly change, but the dream could not hold. King Richard II was only 14, but he met the rebels with remarkable composure. At Smithfield, he rode out to speak with what Tyler faced to face. No one knows exactly what was said. Some accounts say the discussion turned tense, others that it was calm until a sudden spark, an insult, a misunderstanding, caused violence to break out. Tyler was struck down by a royal guard, his body left in the mud. In the confusion, the young king stepped forward and called to the crowd, "You shall have no captain but me." The moment froze history. For a heartbeat, it seemed the people might seize the power they had demanded. But without their leader, and faced with the king's promise of mercy, they began to disperse. Once they returned to their homes, royal soldiers hunted them down. The leaders were executed. The movement was crushed, and yet the idea did not die. Though the rebellion failed, the world that had existed before the plague would never return. Serfdom, weakened by necessity, slowly vanished. Wages rose, towns expanded, and trade flourished once more. The English peasant, who had lived for centuries under the will of others, began to see himself as something more, a person with rights, not merely duties. The church, too, was changing. The same suffering that had shaken the people's faith also reshaped it. Many began to question the wealth and corruption of high clergy who lived in comfort while the poor buried their dead. Quietly, new voices began to speak of reform, of a simpler faith, closer to Christ, unburdened by gold or hierarchy. Those murmurs would grow louder in centuries to come. In the years after the plague and rebellion, the landscape itself seemed different. Fields once choked with weeds bloomed again. New villages were built beside the ruins of old ones. Sheep grazed where farms had fallen, their wool becoming England's new source of wealth. The merchants who sold it abroad grew powerful, building the first fortunes that would one day rival the lords. And through it all, the people endured, as they always had. They planted, harvested, and prayed, but now with a deeper sense of their own worth. They had lived through hunger, through plague, and through the fire of rebellion. What had once been submission had turned quietly into resilience. If you walked through a village then, you would see that life still followed the same rhythm. The morning bell, the fields, the smoke from hearths rising at dusk. Yet something invisible had shifted, a kind of awakening. The world was still bound by the crown and the church, but the people had glimpsed their own power. They could no longer be unseen. The late Middle Ages would carry that quiet revolution forward, through art, through trade, and through thought. The next generation would build cathedrals of glass and stone, not only for kings, but for the spirit of mankind itself. And from the ashes of plague and rebellion, a new dawn would slowly rise, the age of renewal, invention, and the birth of modern England. But for now, as night fell over the villages and the bells tolled softly once more, the survivors of a century of darkness looked up at the same stars that had shone over their ancestors, and perhaps for the first time began to dream of something better. Part 8. The Tudors, Fire and Splendor. The smoke of the Middle Ages had barely cleared when a new age began to stir. The fields of England were green again, the villages rebuilt, and the old feudal order, though scarred, had begun to heal. Trade grew, towns expanded, and the English merchant became as important as the knight once was. Ships from London and Bristol sailed farther than ever before, bringing back cloth, spices, and whispers of discovery beyond the known world. Yet beneath this renewal lay tension. The crown and nobility, still wounded by centuries of war and rebellion, fought for dominance. The church held vast power and wealth, but its voice no longer carried unquestioned authority. And across the land, a quiet yearning for change began to take root, for order, unity, and something grand enough to bind the island's scattered spirit. That longing would find its answer in a new dynasty, born from battle, baptized in ambition. The Tudors. It began on a grey morning in 1485, on a field near the town of Bosworth. There, the final chapter of the Wars of the Roses unfolded, a struggle between two noble houses, Lancaster and York, both claiming the throne. The air was thick with mist and the cries of crows. When the fighting ended, King Richard III lay dead, his crown found in the mud and placed upon the head of a young man named Henry Tudor. With that single act, the long war ended. Henry became Henry VII, the first Tudor king. He was cautious and intelligent, a man who knew that peace, not blood, would secure his legacy. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses of their rival houses into one. Under his rule, the realm steadied. The royal treasury filled once more, and the authority of the crown grew stronger than it had been in generations. But it was his son who would truly shape the age to come. Henry VIII, larger than life, restless and commanding, would turn England from a medieval kingdom into a modern state. At first, Henry was the image of a Renaissance prince. He loved music, poetry, and sport. He built ships and studied theology. His court glittered with scholars and artists. To foreign visitors, he seemed the embodiment of vigor and majesty, a king destined to unite splendor with strength. Yet beneath the gold and pageantry burned a dangerous will. Henry desired power in every form, in war, in love, and in faith itself. When his marriage to Catherine of Aragon produced no surviving sons, he demanded the right to set it aside. But the Pope refused, bound by politics and religion alike. For a lesser man, that might have been the end of the matter. For Henry, it was the beginning of revolution. In a move that would change history, Henry broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing centuries of spiritual obedience to the Pope. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands and treasures seized for the crown. The ancient balance between crown and church was shattered forever. The dissolution of the monasteries transformed the country. Stone by stone, buildings that had stood for hundreds of years were torn down. Gold and manuscripts were carried away, while monks and nuns were turned out into the world. Some wept as they watched their cloisters fall. Others saw it as divine justice against corruption. But for all who lived through it, the change was immense, a world of prayer and stability swept away by the tide of royal will. Henry's England was reborn in both splendor and fear. Those who supported his reforms rose to wealth and influence. Those who opposed them fell swiftly. The Tower of London, once a fortress of kings, became a place of whispers and executions. Friends of yesterday could become traitors overnight. Even queens were not spared. Catherine of Aragon was set aside. Anne Boleyn, who had captured Henry's heart and defied a continent, was crowned queen, only to lose favor and her life within 3 short years. One by one, wives and ministers came and went, victims of Henry's restless pursuit of control and legacy. And yet, for all his cruelty, his decisions reshaped England's destiny. By breaking from Rome, Henry had unleashed forces that could not be contained. The English Reformation had begun. Faith itself was now divided, not by geography, but by conscience. Protestant reformers translated the Bible into English, believing that every man should read the Word of God for himself. For the first time, the sacred language of the Church gave way to the voice of the people. It was a dangerous freedom. Across Europe, the fires of religious conflict burned. In England, suspicion ran deep. Neighbors watched neighbors, and heresy could mean death. But amid the fear, new ideas took root. Printing presses spread words faster than swords could silence them. The age of faith was giving way to the age of thought. When Henry died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom both strengthened and divided, rich, proud, and uncertain of its soul. His son Edward VI ruled briefly and earnestly, advancing Protestant reform. His daughter, Mary, sought to undo it, restoring Catholicism with fierce devotion. Her reign, marked by persecution and flame, earned her the grim name Bloody Mary. And then came Elizabeth. Her arrival marked not just the return of stability but the birth of an age. Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn, became queen in 1558. She was cautious where her father had been bold, diplomatic where her siblings had been devout. She understood that England was tired of war, of dogma, of blood. Her reign would offer something else: balance, identity, and light. Under Elizabeth, the realm blossomed. Artists, poets, and explorers filled her court. Theaters rose in London, and the English language began to sing. Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser gave voice to a people rediscovering themselves through story. The words they wrote of love, ambition, and fate shaped the nation's imagination for centuries to come. The sea became England's new frontier. Sailors like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh circled the globe, bringing tales of distant lands and untold riches. The Queen's ships battled Spain's mighty armada, and against all odds, the English prevailed. When the storm cleared, the flag of St. George flew proud above a nation that had stood alone and survived. Elizabeth's reign was not without shadow. Plots surrounded her. Catholics at home and abroad sought to restore the old faith. Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, became both guest and prisoner, a rival claim wrapped in royal blood. When Mary was executed, it was a decision that haunted Elizabeth's heart, yet ensured her throne. Through triumph and tragedy alike, the Queen endured. She became a symbol, not just of monarchy, but of the spirit of her people. Her England was one of contrasts: light and fire, glory and fear, art and ambition. It was an age of splendor, but also of unease, a kingdom finding its strength through its struggles. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left no heir. Her passing marked the end of the Tudor line, a dynasty that had begun on a muddy battlefield and ended in the golden glow of empire. Yet her death did not bring silence. The world she created, bold, creative, and curious, would not fade. It would pass like a torch into new hands, new lands, and a new age. The Tudors had turned England into a nation of power and imagination. They had given it unity, voice, and pride. But the questions they stirred, of faith, freedom, and rule, would not rest. For even as the candles of the Tudor court burned low, another dawn was rising, one of union and discovery, of kings who sought divine right, and of people who would soon question whether such right could ever be divine at all. Part 9. The Civil War and the Fall of Kings. When Elizabeth I died in the spring of 1603, England mourned not only a queen, but an era. The Elizabethan age had been a time of confidence and light, an age when words, ships, and dreams all seemed to reach farther than ever before. Yet beneath its glow, old questions remained unanswered. Who ruled the soul of England? God, the king, or the people? And how far could power reach before it broke the bond of trust between ruler and ruled? Those questions would soon find their answer in blood. With Elizabeth's death, the crown passed peacefully to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, the two crowns were joined, not yet in law, but in person, uniting the island under one monarch. James was a man of learning and contradiction. He loved scholarship and debate, but he also believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the conviction that monarchs ruled by God's will alone, accountable to no mortal authority. He inherited a realm weary of religious division. The Reformation had left deep scars, and suspicion still lingered between Protestants and Catholics. James sought compromise, but his rule began with a shock that proved how fragile that peace was. In 1605, a group of Catholic conspirators plotted to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the king's visit, an act that would have destroyed the government in a single flame. The gunpowder plot, as it became known, failed when one of the plotters was discovered guarding barrels of powder beneath Westminster. His name was Guy Fawkes. He and his companions were executed, and their plan became a cautionary tale retold for centuries, a reminder that faith and politics, when bound by fear, could ignite into terror. James survived the plot and ruled for more than 20 years. He sponsored the great translation of the Bible that would bear his name, the King James Version, a work of language and devotion that gave sacred words a rhythm as enduring as the English tongue itself. Yet his belief in absolute authority sowed quiet resentment. Parliament, increasingly confident and aware of its power, began to question the king's right to rule without consent. When James died in 1625, he left the throne to his son, a young man of principle and dignity, but little understanding of compromise. Charles I. Charles was no tyrant by design. He was reserved, cultured, and devout. But he carried himself as if his crown were unassailable, as if the will of a king were the same as the will of God. He married a French Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria, which alarmed his Protestant subjects. He spent lavishly on art and ceremony, believing majesty could inspire unity. Instead, it deepened mistrust. His relationship with Parliament quickly soured. He demanded taxes without approval, dismissed those who questioned him, and ruled alone for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule. During that time, he strengthened royal control, enforced religious conformity, and imposed fines on those who resisted. To many, it felt as though the freedoms promised in Magna Carta were slipping away. In villages and taverns, people whispered of tyranny. Preachers thundered from pulpits about corruption and divine justice. When Charles tried to impose his religious reforms on Scotland, forcing the use of the English prayer book, rebellion broke out. Armies gathered. The king, desperate for funds, recalled Parliament. But the members who assembled were not loyal courtiers. They were men of conviction, weary of obedience. What followed was not a single event, but a slow descent. Words gave way to accusations, accusations to arms. In 1642, Charles raised his standard at Nottingham, and the English Civil War began. Brother fought brother. Families were divided by loyalty and faith. On one side stood the Royalists, or Cavaliers, those who believed in the sacred authority of the crown. On the other stood the Parliamentarians, or Roundheads, who believed the king's power must answer to the people's representatives. The first battles were uncertain, fought across fields and villages that had never known such horror. Muskets cracked, cannon smoke rolled across meadows, and the thunder of hooves echoed through valleys that had once been quiet. Towns changed hands, alliances shifted, and both sides prayed that God would bless their cause. As the war dragged on, new figures rose from obscurity. Among them was Oliver Cromwell, a stern, driven man of deep faith and sharper will. He built an army not of nobles but of believers, the new model army, disciplined, zealous, and convinced of its divine mission. At Marston Moor and Naseby, Cromwell's forces broke the royalist lines. Charles fled north, seeking refuge in Scotland, but was handed over to Parliament. Even in defeat, he remained steadfast, believing that kingship was sacred and could not be judged by men. The conflict should have ended there, but it did not. The victors themselves were divided. Parliamentarians against radicals, soldiers against politicians. Charles saw their disunity and sought to exploit it. Secret negotiations, new plots, and another brief war followed. But the tide had turned. In 1648, Charles was captured once more. This time, there would be no return. Parliament put him on trial, an act unprecedented in English history. A king, accused by his own people, stood before judges who represented the nation he had ruled. When asked to answer the charges, Charles refused. He declared that no court had authority over him. His words were dignified, but they could not save him. On a cold January morning in 1649, Charles I walked onto a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts to keep from shivering, not from fear, but from the cold. He addressed the crowd with calm resolve, affirming his faith and forgiving those who condemned him. Then, at a single stroke of the axe, the monarchy ended. A groan rose from the onlookers, followed by silence. For the first time in its history, England was without a king. What followed was not peace, but a difficult experiment. The country became a commonwealth, ruled first by Parliament and then, effectively, by Cromwell himself. The House of Lords was abolished, the monarchy declared dead, and the land placed under strict Puritan rule. Cromwell's government was austere and disciplined. Theaters closed, feasting and celebration were curtailed, and even Christmas was marked by fasting rather than joy. The ideals of faith and equality that had driven the revolution were slowly buried beneath the weight of control. Yet not all was bleak. Cromwell sought to reform the law, to promote education, and to allow freedom of worship for many who had long been silenced. Under his watch, England's navy grew strong, and its influence abroad expanded. For a brief time, it seemed as if the dream of a righteous nation might endure. But power, even when born of principle, carries its own corruption. When Cromwell died in 1658, the experiment faltered. The nation, weary of discipline and division, longed again for stability, for ceremony, music, and the familiar crown. 2 years later, the monarchy was restored. Charles II, son of the executed king, returned from exile to cheering crowds. London filled with celebration. Bells rang, bonfires burned, and for a moment it seemed as if the nightmare of civil war had been washed away. Yet beneath the joy lay memory of a time when a people had dared to judge their king and found him mortal. The Restoration brought back laughter, art, and theater, but the questions of authority and conscience remained. The crown was restored, yes, but it was no longer absolute. The church was rebuilt, but it no longer held every soul. The people had learned that even the mightiest power could be challenged, and that truth once spoken could not be unlearned. From that struggle came something enduring, the slow birth of constitutional rule. The idea that the king might govern, but only by the consent of the governed. It was not yet democracy, not yet freedom as we know it, but the seed had been planted. In the years ahead, the island would face fire, plague, and foreign war once more. But through it all, that seed of liberty, fragile, precious, and hard-won, would continue to grow. The age of divine kingship had ended on a scaffold. The age of reason, though still distant, had begun its long, slow rise. Part 10. Restoration and Enlightenment. When the exiled king returned in 1660, London erupted in celebration. Bells rang across the Thames, fires glowed in the streets, and crowds cheered as Charles II entered the city his father had died to defend. For nearly 20 years, England had been ruled by generals and lawmakers. Now, the monarchy was restored, and with it came a longing for color, music, and life. Charles was no stern reformer like Cromwell, nor a silent penitent like his father. He had lived in the courts of France and Holland during exile, where laughter and luxury softened the edge of politics. When he came home, he brought that same spirit, a taste for art, theater, and wit. The court once again became a place of light and noise, where poets recited verses, musicians played into the night, and actors performed on stages long closed by Puritan decree. For the weary nation, it was a breath of release. Taverns filled, plays returned, and the people embraced the simple joy of living without fear. The years of discipline had ended, the years of indulgence had begun, but the new age was not one of peace alone. The Restoration carried contradictions. Beneath the glitter of Charles's court, the old divisions of faith and power remained. The Church of England was re-established as the national faith, yet Catholics and dissenters found themselves once more outside its walls. Parliament, revived after its long silence, watched the king carefully, wary of any hint of tyranny returning. Charles, charming but pragmatic, balanced it all with grace. He knew that laughter was safer than law, that pleasure could calm what policy could not, and so, under his reign, the island began to breathe again. But the 1660s would test that newfound hope in ways no king could control. In 1665 the plague returned, not with the sudden terror of the Black Death, but with the slow, dreadful familiarity of an old enemy. It began quietly in the narrow lanes of London, where rats scurried through the gutters and ships from abroad carried more than goods. At first it was only rumor, a few deaths, a few locked houses. Then it spread. Whole parishes were sealed. Red crosses were painted on doors with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Those who could afford to flee fled. The rich escaped to the countryside, leaving the poor behind in silence and stench. In the deserted city, only the bellmen moved through the streets, their lanterns dim in the fog, calling out the nightly toll of the dead. And then, as if to purge the sickness with flame, came the Great Fire. In September 1666, a spark in a baker's oven on Pudding Lane ignited a disaster that consumed almost everything in its path. For 4 days the city burned. The sky turned red, then black, as wind carried the fire from house to house. St. Paul's Cathedral, the heart of old London, collapsed in a storm of ash. Thousands were left homeless, watching from the riverbanks as centuries of wood and stone turned to smoke. When the flames finally died, the city lay in ruin. But in the ruins, the seeds of renewal were already taking root. Charles II, with the calm confidence that had carried him through exile and plague, ordered London rebuilt, wider streets, stronger walls, better drains. He called upon Christopher Wren, a man of mathematics and imagination, to design a new skyline. Out of destruction rose domes and spires, none greater than the new St. Paul's, a monument not to loss, but to endurance. The fire had cleansed more than streets. It marked the end of the medieval city and the beginning of the modern one. Through the late 17th century, England changed faster than it ever had before. Trade with the colonies expanded. Coffeehouses became centers of debate and exchange. Here, merchants, scholars, and philosophers met over steaming cups to discuss not kings or battles, but ideas, reason, science, and the nature of truth. It was in those dim, lively rooms that the Enlightenment began to take root. Men like Isaac Newton studied the laws of motion and light, revealing that the universe moved by patterns, not miracles. Others, like John Locke, wrote of liberty and governance, arguing that kings ruled not by divine decree, but by the consent of the governed. These were dangerous thoughts once, but in the calm after chaos, they found fertile ground. The island that had executed one king and restored another was beginning to think differently about power. Faith and reason no longer stood as enemies, they became partners in the pursuit of understanding. The mind, long bound by the chains of doctrine and fear, began to stretch toward the stars. Meanwhile, the crown itself changed hands once more. When Charles II died in 1685, his brother James took the throne, James II, a Catholic king in a Protestant land. At first, the people tolerated him, weary of upheaval. But as James filled his court with Catholic allies and dismissed Protestant officers, the balance tilted dangerously again. Fearing another descent into tyranny, a group of nobles turned not to rebellion, but to invitation. In 1688, they called upon William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, and husband to his daughter Mary, to intervene. William landed on English shores with a modest army expecting resistance. Instead, he found none. The king's supporters melted away. Even his daughter joined William's cause. James fled into exile, and the throne passed peacefully to William and Mary. It was not a conquest, but a revolution. The Glorious Revolution, as history would call it, bloodless, but transformative. From it emerged a new covenant between ruler and ruled. The Bill of Rights, enacted in 1689, set the boundaries of monarchy and the rights of Parliament. No king could suspend laws, levy taxes, or raise armies without consent. The crown was not abolished, but harnessed. The rule of will had become the rule of law. This moment marked more than a change of kings. It marked the birth of constitutional government. The divine right of monarchs had given way to something new, the idea that the people, through Parliament, were the guardians of their own liberty. The transformation was quiet but profound. In cathedrals and coffeehouses alike, the air seemed lighter. Artists painted not only saints and kings, but landscapes, faces, and lives of ordinary beauty. Books spread faster, newspapers flourished, and curiosity became the new faith. By the dawn of the 18th century, the island was no longer a medieval realm. It was a modern nation, cautious, proud, and alive with invention. Its ships circled the world, its thinkers questioned the heavens, and its people began to imagine a future shaped not by birth, but by mind. Yet progress carried its own shadows. The same trade that brought prosperity also carried chains. In distant colonies, human lives were bought and sold to fuel English wealth. The contradiction between liberty at home and oppression abroad would grow into a moral wound that later generations would struggle to heal. But for now, the story of England was one of light after darkness. It had survived war, fire, and plague, and found wisdom in their ashes. The great dome of St. Paul's stood above London like a promise, that from ruin could rise reason, and from turmoil, order. The age of kings had become the age of ideas. And in that new light, a greater power was stirring, the hum of workshops, the turning of gears, and the first whisper of steam. The next revolution would not be of thrones or faith, but of industry itself. Part 11. The Age of Industry and Empire. The new century dawned with the soft hum of progress. In the quiet hills and crowded towns of Britain, something unseen was beginning to stir. A force as powerful as any army, as transformative as any faith. It did not roar into life overnight. It began in whispers, the clatter of a new machine, the hiss of steam, the turning of a wheel. The 17th century had ended in reason and reform. The 18th began in curiosity. Everywhere, men and women seemed to be asking the same question: what else is possible? The countryside was still green and slow, dotted with windmills and grazing sheep. But in workshops tucked behind stone cottages, inventors bent over gears and pipes, seeking new ways to harness power. The first breakthroughs came not from palaces or universities, but from coal-streaked hands and restless minds, miners, mechanics, and craftsmen who watched the earth itself and learned its rhythm. Coal had long been a silent companion of Britain, dug from hillsides, burned in hearths. But now it became something more. It was fuel for a new kind of fire, one that did not fade with the setting sun. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen built a machine to pump water from the deep mines of Devon. It wheezed and groaned, powered by steam, and though crude by later standards, it worked. It was the first breath of the Industrial Revolution. Decades later, James Watt refined the idea, making the steam engine faster, stronger, and more efficient. His design would power mills, locomotives, and ships, turning raw energy into motion. Where once Britain's wealth had flowed from land and labor, it now flowed from invention. Towns grew around the smoke of their factories. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Glasgow, names that had once meant little outside their counties, became engines of the world. The air itself changed, filled with soot, sound, and the heartbeat of machines. The old rhythm of dawn and dusk gave way to the whistle of shifts and the turning of wheels that never truly stopped. It was an age of wonder and of cost. The same machines that lifted men into prosperity also ground others into exhaustion. In the mills and mines, children worked beside their parents, their faces pale under the flicker of gaslight. 12-hour days, endless noise, and meager wages became the price of progress. Yet through hardship came endurance. The British people had learned to survive hunger, plague, and war. They would now survive smoke. As steam conquered land, sails began to yield to iron. In shipyards along the Thames and the Clyde, blackened hands hammered out the frames of vessels that would cross oceans without wind. The Industrial Revolution was not just a change of tools, it was a change of destiny. The island that had once looked inward now turned its gaze outward, toward empire. Trade became empire's pulse. From the Caribbean came sugar and rum. From India came silk, tea, and spice. From Africa came human lives, an atrocity that darkened the very glory Britain claimed to build. For more than 2 centuries, the Atlantic slave trade carried millions across the sea in chains, their suffering fueling the wealth of nations. Even as London's merchants toasted progress, their fortunes were written in the agony of others. And yet, within that same empire, the seeds of conscience began to grow. Voices rose, first quietly, then as a chorus, demanding an end to slavery. In 1787, a group of reformers gathered in a London printing house to form the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Among them was William Wilberforce, whose faith and determination would turn morality into movement. Year after year, they fought against greed, habit, and politics. They printed pamphlets, gathered petitions, and spoke in Parliament until at last, in 1807, the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire. It was not the end of suffering, but it was a beginning proof that conscience could move even the machinery of power. By then, Britain was already the workshop of the world. Steamships crossed the oceans. Railways cut through fields and valleys, binding distant towns into one vast web. A journey that once took days on horseback could now be made in hours by train. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than any messenger could ride. Time itself seemed to shrink, bending to the pace of invention. Cities swelled beyond imagination. London grew into a metropolis of more than 1 million souls, crowded, restless, and alive with contrast. The glow of gas lamps reflected in puddles along cobbled streets, where carriages rattled past beggars and gentlemen alike. The smell of smoke hung over the city, but so did a sense of possibility. In drawing rooms, philosophers debated progress and poverty. In taverns, laborers dreamed of fairness. The same age that built palaces of industry also birthed the idea of reform, the belief that humanity could, through knowledge and will, improve itself. It was an age of contradictions, of soot and silver, of invention and inequity. But it was also an age of optimism. To live in 18th century Britain was to believe for the first time that change was not only possible, but inevitable. As the century turned, Britain's empire reached across every ocean. Red lines on maps traced its holdings from the Caribbean to Canada, from Africa to India, from Australia to distant islands whose names few at home could pronounce. The phrase "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was not mere poetry, it was truth, and yet empire carried a weight of its own. To sustain such reach required armies, ships, and endless resources. The taxes that funded expansion also fueled resentment. In the American colonies, voices of independence began to rise. "No taxation without representation," they declared, the cry of a people who had learned the lessons of liberty from Britain herself. In 1776, those colonies broke away, forming a new nation across the Atlantic. The loss stung deeply, but it did not stop the empire's momentum. Instead, Britain turned east, toward India and the seas beyond. There, trade became conquest. The East India Company, once a merchant venture, grew into a government of its own, an empire within an empire. Its flags flew over forts and cities, its armies commanded millions. It brought roads, railways, and bureaucracy, but also hunger, rebellion, and exploitation. The pattern of empire was clear. Wealth flowed in, cost flowed out. Back home, the Industrial Revolution continued to accelerate. Textile mills spun cotton imported from distant lands. Coal and iron fed furnaces that glowed red through the night. Towns expanded faster than laws could contain them. Streets overflowed with smoke and noise, but also with invention. The printing press, the spinning jenny, the locomotive, the steamship. The rhythm of progress was relentless, and in its shadow, reform began to stir once more. The working poor demanded better conditions, and writers turned their pens into weapons of empathy. Charles Dickens, with his stories of orphans and workhouses, gave faces to suffering that statistics could not. Others called for education, sanitation, and the right to vote, the slow, stubborn work of making progress humane. In science, too, the spirit of discovery reached new heights. Natural philosophers, soon to be called scientists, peered into the mysteries of electricity, chemistry, and life itself. The world was being measured, mapped, and understood in ways that once belonged only to myth. Knowledge had become the new form of power. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain stood at the center of the modern world, a nation of engines, empire, and ambition. Its inventions lit other lands, its ideas spread through books and speeches. But its heart remained divided, between conscience and commerce, between the glory it built and the cost it ignored. Steam, steel, and empire had made Britain mighty. But beneath the soot lay something older, the same endurance that had carried the island through conquest, plague, and fire. The people who worked in its factories and sailed its ships were not the lords of empire, but its pulse. Their labor turned wheels, their songs echoed in foundries, their faith endured the weight of industry. As the century drew on, change would come again, not from kings or inventors, but from the voices of those who demanded fairness and reform. The empire would continue to expand, yet so too would the call for justice, equality, and education. The age of industry had given Britain power beyond measure. The age of empire had given it reach beyond sight. But the next great revolution, the one that would reshape hearts and minds, would come not from machines or armies, but from ideas of human worth. For even in the roar of engines and the clatter of wheels, the spirit of Britain remained what it had always been, restless, curious, and unwilling to stand still. And soon, in the streets of London, and the far corners of the empire, the question would rise again, not of how much power a nation could hold, but of what kind of world it ought to build with it. Part 12. The Victorian Mirror. By the time Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, Britain was already the beating heart of the modern world. Its cities glowed with gaslight, its ships crossed every ocean, and its factories roared like iron thunder. The young queen, barely 18, stepped into an empire that stretched farther than any before it, vast, confident, and proud. Yet beneath its brilliance, the age she would rule was a mirror reflecting both the light of progress and the darkness of its cost. Victoria's reign began quietly, with optimism and hope. The long years of war with Napoleon were over, and peace had given space for growth. The railways were spreading like veins across the land, carrying not only coal and goods, but also people, families, workers, dreamers, traveling faster than any generation before them. Telegraph wires crisscrossed the countryside, binding distant towns in threads of copper and message. The empire was no longer just a map. It was a system, pulsing with movement and ambition. In London, the streets swelled with new life. The city had become a world unto itself, a place of towering wealth and desperate poverty. Along the grand avenues, gentlemen in top hats shared space with chimney sweeps and beggars. Carriages rattled beside barefoot children selling matches. Smoke hung above the skyline like a second sky, and through it all, the steady toll of church bells reminded everyone that even in an age of machines, time still belonged to God. The Victorian world believed deeply in progress, in the power of human effort, and the promise of improvement. Inventions seemed to appear with every season: steam engines, sewing machines, telegraphs, and cameras that captured time itself. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the glittering glass halls of the Crystal Palace, celebrated it all. Inside its walls, inventions from every corner of the world gleamed beneath sunlight filtered through glass, a temple to industry and empire. Visitors walked in awe beneath its arches, marveling at the engines, fabrics, and machines that seemed to promise endless advancement. It was a triumph of confidence, a statement that Britain had mastered nature itself. But outside the palace, reality whispered a different story. In the narrow alleys of London's East End, families lived 6 to a room. The smell of coal smoke mixed with sewage in the air. Children worked in factories, their small hands quick and nimble, their faces gray with dust. In the mines of the North, men and boys labored in darkness from dawn to dusk, emerging coated in soot and silence. The wealth of empire and industry had built palaces, but it had also built prisons of labor. The Victorians, proud of their achievements, were forced to confront their conscience. They looked into the mirror of progress and did not always like what they saw. Writers became the nation's voice of reflection. Charles Dickens, with his novels of orphans and injustice, peeled back the glittering veneer of the age to reveal the suffering beneath. His words carried the cries of the poor into parlors and drawing rooms where such voices had never been heard before. Elizabeth Gaskell, Thomas Carlyle, and others joined him, demanding compassion from those who ruled the mills and offices of empire. Their stories did not stop the machines, but they changed the hearts of those who built them. Slowly, laws were passed, limiting child labor, improving sanitation, and recognizing the rights of workers. The same age that had invented poverty on a grand scale also invented reform. Queen Victoria herself became a symbol of endurance. Her long reign spanned more than 60 years, from carriages to motor cars, from candlelight to electricity. She was both monarch and mother, both distant and deeply human. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she withdrew from public life, plunging the nation into mourning that lasted for years. Black crape appeared in every window. The empire itself seemed to hold its breath. Yet even in her grief, Victoria's reign continued to shape the world. Under her name, Britain reached the height of its empire. India, Australia, Canada, and parts of Africa all fell under its flag. In every corner of the globe, the red of the British dominions spread like sunrise. The empire became both pride and burden, celebrated by some as civilization's triumph, condemned by others as conquest in disguise. In India, railways and education followed the Union Jack, but so did famine and rebellion. The Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, born of anger and cultural insult, revealed how fragile the illusion of control truly was. The rebellion was crushed, but its echo changed everything. The British Crown took direct control of India, ending the rule of the East India Company. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, her title both majestic and uneasy, a reminder that glory and guilt often traveled together. At home, new classes emerged. The middle class, merchants, clerks, and professionals grew rapidly, their fortunes built not on birth, but on trade and skill. Education expanded, literacy rose, and newspapers became the nation's conscience. The idea of respectability became a code, Hard work, thrift, and morality were prized above all else. Yet the same ideals that encouraged discipline also bred hypocrisy. Behind closed doors, many struggled beneath the weight of expectation and secrecy. Science, too, began to challenge belief. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, a work that shook the foundations of faith. His theory of evolution by natural selection offered a new, unsettling view of humanity's place in creation. To some, it was heresy, to others, revelation. The debate that followed stretched across generations, reshaping the relationship between science and soul. But the Victorians were nothing if not adaptable. They built museums, schools, and universities to study the very forces that unsettled them. The thirst for knowledge and for control became the pulse of the age. As the 19th century advanced, cities grew denser, railways faster, and the world smaller. London became a center not only of power, but of imagination. The arts flourished, from the melancholy paintings of the Pre-Raphaelites to the symphonies of Elgar. Architecture reached upward. Bridges of iron, clock towers of stone, and at last the great spire of the Houses of Parliament crowned by Big Ben's steady chime. Each tick of that clock marked both progress and impermanence. It was the sound of a nation in motion, yet haunted by time itself. By the final decades of Victoria's reign, the empire's confidence began to waver. The same industrial strength that had built wealth also bred pollution and unrest. Strikes erupted in factories and docks. Irish nationalists demanded self-rule. In Africa, the competition for territory turned brutal, carving whole continents into lines drawn in distant offices. The empire still called itself enlightened, yet its shadow grew long. In that mirror of industry and empire, Britain saw not only triumph, but the reflection of its own contradictions. It was the richest nation in the world, and one of the most unequal. It was a champion of liberty, and yet ruled millions who had none. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the nation mourned as it never had before. Her funeral was both an ending and a reckoning. The long 19th century, that great engine of invention, order, and empire, had run its course. Behind her coffin marched soldiers from every corner of the world, Sikhs, Zulus, Scots, and Irishmen, all bearing the banners of a global power. The procession passed through streets lined with silent crowds, workers, widows, scholars, and children, all part of the empire she had ruled. In that moment, Britain stood at the peak of its strength. Yet somewhere deep within, the age of certainty was slipping away. New forces were stirring: democracy, socialism, suffrage, and the faint hum of machines no longer driven by steam but by electricity and war. The Victorian Mirror had shown the nation its greatness and its flaws. What came next would test whether the empire could endure its own reflection. The next century would bring challenges unlike any before: the shattering roar of modern warfare, the rise of new powers, and the long, slow twilight of empire itself. But for now, the lamps of the Victorian world still glowed softly against the night, a warm, flickering light that carried both pride and sorrow, shining on the threshold of a new and uncertain age. Part 13. The Great Wars. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain stood tall, proud, wealthy, and unchallenged. The empire stretched across continents. The pound was the world's currency, and the Royal Navy ruled the seas. From London's foggy docks to the deserts of Africa and the jungles of Asia, the Union Jack fluttered in every wind. To many, it seemed the empire would last forever. But time, as always, had other plans. The world was changing. Machines had grown faster, cities louder, and nations hungrier for power. Across Europe, alliances tangled like wires. Germany, France, Russia, Austria, Britain, each bound together in treaties meant to preserve peace. but destined instead to ignite war. The fuse was long and quiet, until one summer morning in 1914, in a faraway city called Sarajevo, a shot was fired that would echo through every corner of the earth. A young Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. It was a single act by a single hand, but it set in motion the machinery of empire. Within weeks, Europe descended into chaos. One by one, nations declared war, alliances triggered, promises called in, pride overriding reason. Britain hesitated, but only briefly. When Germany invaded neutral Belgium, violating the small nation's sovereignty, the British government declared war in defense of principle and empire. The date was August 4, 1914. The soldiers cheered as they boarded trains and ships. They believed the war would be over by Christmas. They carried letters, cigarettes, and songs, hearts full of duty, faces bright with the confidence of youth. They did not yet know what lay ahead. Across the Channel, they met a world of mud and fire. The Western Front stretched like a scar across France and Belgium. Hundreds of miles of trenches, wire, and ruin. The war that had begun with movement and cavalry soon settled into stillness, men digging into the earth like moles, facing one another across fields of desolation. Day after day, the guns thundered. The air trembled with shellfire. The ground shook like a living thing. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of filth. Rats grew fat on the dead. Men huddled in the cold, waiting for orders that would send them over the top, into a storm of bullets, gas, and steel. The names of those battles would echo for generations: Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele. At the Somme alone, on a single July morning, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. There were no heroes on that field, only survivors. Back home, the war touched every life. Women filled the factories, driving the machines that forged weapons and munitions. Children gathered scrap metal. Farmers sent grain to the front. The empire itself answered the call. From Canada, India, Australia, and Africa, millions came to fight for a king and a cause they had never seen. The war changed everything. It broke class barriers, silenced certainty, and forced a generation to question the very meaning of progress. The poets who lived through it, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Rupert Brooke, wrote words that still carry the weight of that loss. They described not glory, but futility. Not triumph, but endurance. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world was exhausted. The armistice brought peace, but not joy. 10 million dead, millions more wounded, nations shattered, empires gone. Britain had won the war, but at a cost too great to measure. In the years that followed, the empire began to change. The soldiers who returned did not return as subjects. They returned as men who had seen the truth of equality in the mud. The women who had worked in the factories refused to return to silence. Votes for women came slowly, then surely. First for the few, then for all. The 1920s shimmered with hope and unease. Cities buzzed with jazz and motion, while unemployment haunted the streets. Airplanes and motorcars shrank the world, even as walls of class and poverty remained. The empire held, but the illusion of invincibility had cracked. Then came the 1930s, the decade of doubt. The Great Depression swept across oceans like a chill wind. Factories closed, fortunes vanished, and hunger returned to cities that had thought it banished forever. And in the distance a darker sound began to rise, the marching rhythm of a new power, a shadow growing in the heart of Europe. Germany, humiliated by defeat and burdened by debt, turned toward extremism. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising revenge and renewal. He rebuilt his nation's army, silenced dissent, and pointed his ambitions toward conquest. Britain watched, weary and uncertain. The memory of the last war hung like smoke over every decision. Appeasement became the word of the age, a hope that diplomacy might calm the storm. But by 1939, hope was no longer enough. When German forces invaded Poland, Britain once again declared war. The Second World War had begun. This time the war was different. Faster, wider, more brutal. The skies filled with planes, the seas with submarines, the cities with fear. London endured the blitz, night after night of bombs that turned streets to rubble and fire. Families huddled in underground stations, singing to drown the sound of falling walls. Through it all, a stubborn courage endured, the quiet defiance that would come to define the British spirit. "Keep calm and carry on," the poster said, and they did. In 1940, when France fell and Britain stood alone, Winston Churchill rose to lead. His voice, gravelly, relentless, became the heartbeat of the nation. He promised not peace, but perseverance. "We shall fight on the beaches," he said, "we shall never surrender." And in the dark summer that followed, as German bombers blackened the skies, the Royal Air Force held its ground. Young pilots, many barely out of school, fought and died in the Battle of Britain, and won. The war raged across the world, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, from the frozen wastes of Russia to the beaches of Normandy. The empire fought as one. Men from India, Canada, Australia, and Africa joined the struggle. Millions under one banner, one cause. By 1945, the tide had turned. Germany lay in ruins, its leader dead, its dream of domination broken. But victory carried sorrow. In the east, 2 atomic bombs fell upon Japan, bringing the war to its end but revealing the terrible new power humanity had unleashed. When peace returned, it was quiet, almost solemn. Britain had survived, but changed beyond recognition. The empire that had once seemed eternal began to dissolve, as colonies sought independence and nations reclaimed their voice. India was the first in 1947, its freedom marking both pride and loss. Others would follow. At home, the people demanded something better than the world they had fought to save. From the ashes of war came the dream of a fairer society, the National Health Service, welfare, and education for all. It was not empire that defined Britain now, but care. The belief that a nation's greatness lay in its compassion. The 20th century had begun with confidence and conquest. It had passed through fire, ruin, and awakening. And as the smoke of war cleared, Britain stood smaller in power, but perhaps greater in purpose. The 2 great wars had stripped away illusion and pride, leaving behind something humbler, a recognition of endurance, sacrifice, and shared humanity. The empire of stone had fallen, but an empire of memory remained, of courage, kindness, and the stubborn will to rebuild. If you walk through London today, you can still hear the echoes of that time, in the silence at memorials, in the toll of bells on Remembrance Day, in the wind that sweeps across the Thames. The city, like the nation, carries its history not as weight, but as rhythm, steady, sorrowful, and proud. The age of empire had ended. The age of survival had begun. And soon, from the rubble of the old world, a new Britain would rise, one built not on dominion, but on resilience. The fires of war had burned away grandeur, leaving something quieter and stronger in its place, the enduring heart of an island that refused to bow to darkness. Part 14. Winds of Change. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Britain was tired, deeply, quietly tired. The victory parades filled the streets with cheers, but beneath the music and flags lay exhaustion. For 6 years the people had lived in the shadow of bombs and ration books of telegrams that brought loss to every neighborhood. The country had survived, but at a cost measured not only in lives, but in spirit. The cities bore scars like open wounds. London's skyline was a mixture of ruin and resilience. Church spires standing among hollowed shells of buildings, smoke-blackened walls rising above gardens where weeds grew through broken stone. Coventry lay in rubble, its cathedral roof open to the sky. Across the nation, homes had been destroyed, families scattered, industries worn thin. And yet, even among the ruins, hope took root. For years, people had fought not just for victory, but for the promise of something better. During the darkest nights of war, they had spoken of a new beginning, a Britain fairer, kinder, and more equal. Now, as peace returned, they were determined to make it real. In 1945, while the world was still catching its breath, Britain held an election. The people, weary of slogans and sacrifice, chose not the hero of war, Winston Churchill, but the quiet reformer Clement Attlee. His Labour government set out to rebuild the nation from the ground up, not with empire or glory, but with dignity and care. It began with the most human of ideas, that everyone, no matter their wealth, deserved health, housing, and hope. From that vision came the National Health Service, founded in 1948. For the first time in history, medicine became a right, not a privilege. Doctors and nurses who had treated the wounded in wartime now treated the sick in peacetime. The nation that had once built ships and guns now built hospitals and homes. The welfare state followed, unemployment support, pensions, and education for all. It was the quiet revolution of a weary people determined that suffering should not be the inheritance of peace. But while the home front rebuilt, the world beyond Britain's shores was changing even faster. The empire, stretched thin by 2 world wars, could no longer hold. In 1947, India gained its independence, an event both joyful and painful, marked by celebration and sorrow. The jewel of the empire had slipped from the crown, but in truth, the age of empires was already ending. One by one, nations across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean began to demand self-rule. Some achieved it peacefully, others through struggle. Britain, no longer a conqueror, began to see itself as something else, a partner, an ally, a memory. The world map, once painted red, slowly faded into shades of independence. At home, life was still austere. Rationing continued into the 1950s, long after the war had ended. The winter of 1947 was bitter and dark, one of the coldest in memory. Coal froze in the yards, power failed, and families huddled together for warmth. Yet even in hardship there was a sense of unity. People had known worse. The spirit that had carried them through the Blitz now carried them through recovery. By the time a young Queen Elizabeth II took the throne in 1952, the nation was ready to look forward again. Her coronation was broadcast on the new miracle of television. Millions gathered around flickering black and white screens, seeing the crown pass from one generation to another. For a moment, it felt as if the island's story had renewed itself once more. The 1950s were years of slow rebuilding. New towns rose on the edges of old cities, filled with houses of brick and hope. Cars became common, radios hummed in every kitchen, and children grew up in a world where peace felt normal again. But beneath that calm surface, the foundations were shifting. The empire was gone, and Britain was still learning how to live without it. In 1956, the Suez Crisis exposed the truth that the days of commanding global power had ended. When British forces invaded Egypt to reclaim control of the Suez Canal, the world's response was not admiration, but condemnation. Under pressure from allies and enemies alike, Britain was forced to withdraw. It was a humiliation, quiet but undeniable. The illusion of empire had finally dissolved. Yet in losing its empire, Britain began to find its identity anew. It turned inward toward culture, innovation, and imagination. The arts blossomed. Writers, musicians, and filmmakers gave voice to a generation no longer defined by war or conquest. In the cafes of London Soho, jazz mixed with poetry. In Liverpool and Manchester, young men picked up guitars and changed music forever. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and countless others carried the sound of post-war Britain across the world, not as rulers but as storytellers. The 1960s became a decade of transformation. Old hierarchies crumbled, and new freedoms emerged. Fashion, art, and attitude all shifted toward expression and equality. Women, inspired by decades of quiet strength, demanded independence and recognition. The civil rights movement abroad found echoes in British streets. It was a time of color, contrast, and confidence, an empire of creativity replacing one of conquest. But change brought uncertainty too. The nation wrestled with questions of class, immigration, and belonging. Workers from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa arrived to rebuild the country's labor force, bringing new cultures and voices to its towns and cities. The Windrush generation, as they came to be known, faced both opportunity and prejudice, welcomed by some, rejected by others. Their presence reshaped Britain, slowly, permanently, beautifully. The 1970s came with different storms, strikes, inflation, and doubt. Factories closed, unions clashed with governments, and the optimism of the previous decade dimmed. The island that had once ruled half the world struggled to find its place in a new global order. Yet even in hardship, the British habit of endurance endured. In the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, the nation shifted again. Industry gave way to finance, minds to markets, tradition to modernity. The change was fierce and divisive, leaving some richer, others left behind. The streets that once echoed with factory whistles now heard the hum of computers and the voices of protest. Still, through every change, Britain held on to something constant, a quiet resilience, born not of arrogance, but of memory. The people who had endured war and loss had learned how to rebuild. They had learned that identity is not fixed in empire or wealth, but in persistence. By the turn of the century, the island stood transformed once more. Its cities were cosmopolitan, its people diverse, its voice global. The old empire had become the Commonwealth, a partnership of nations connected not by conquest, but by shared history and cooperation. The royal family, once a symbol of authority, had become one of continuity, a thread tying the past to the present. Through decades of change, Queen Elizabeth II remained calm and constant, her image on every coin and stamp, her words a steady anchor in an age of noise. And yet, beneath the ceremony, the story of Britain remained what it had always been, a story of reinvention. From island to empire, from empire to nation, it had learned to shed its skins without losing its soul. If you walk through London today, past the memorials of war and the glass towers of trade, you can still feel those winds of change, the breath of history moving softly through the streets. It carries the echo of ships departing for distant seas, the hum of factories, the songs of protest, and the quiet murmur of survival. The Britain that emerged from the 20th century was smaller in power but larger in spirit, humbled, diverse, and aware of its shared humanity. The empire was gone, but its legacy lingered in language, in culture, in the faces of a nation that now looked outward and inward all at once. And beyond the noise of modern life, one truth remained. The strength of Britain had never been in its borders, but in its people, stubborn, resilient, endlessly changing, endlessly enduring. The wind still blows across the island, carrying echoes of the past and whispers of what's yet to come. It tells a story that began in stone and shadow, in conquest and faith, in war and renewal. A story that has never truly ended. Part 15. The Isles Today, Memory and Continuity. The story of Great Britain is not a straight road. It is a winding path, paved with conquest and compassion, invention and loss, belief and doubt. It began on scattered islands of stone and mist, where ancient tribes carved meaning into rock, and it continues today in cities of glass and steel, where millions move beneath skies once watched by kings. The island has changed countless times, but it has never stopped being itself. Today, the hum of the modern world fills the air where once only church bells rang. Motorways curve where Roman roads once stretched. The same Thames that carried Viking ships now reflects the glow of skyscrapers and cranes. Trains glide silently beneath the streets where plague carts once rolled. And yet, beneath the noise, the island's old rhythm remains, the slow pulse of rain, tide, and time. The people who walk these streets are no longer the subjects of an empire. They are the heirs of endurance. Their ancestors plowed fields beneath Norman towers, sang hymns in candlelight through plague and famine, built ships that crossed oceans and fought wars that shook the world. Each generation remade the island in its own image, and still it endures not as a relic, but as a living memory. Britain today is a mosaic. Its streets speak in 100 accents, its food in 1,000 flavors. From the curry houses of Birmingham to the markets of Brixton, from the mosques of Leicester to the synagogues of Manchester, every voice adds a new verse to an ancient song. What was once an empire of conquest has become an archipelago of cultures, bound not by power but by coexistence. The ghosts of history walk quietly beside the living. They linger in the stones of Westminster, in the worn steps of cathedrals, in the cliffs that have watched 1,000 years of sails come and go. Every town has its echoes, a battlefield turned to meadow, a mill turned to museum, a harbor once filled with ships now filled with silence. The past is not gone here. It rests just beneath the surface like roots beneath grass. The monarchy still stands, changed, softened, and symbolic. No longer the power that commands, but the voice that remembers. Through wars, decolonization, and renewal, the royal family became less the rulers of the people and more the reflection of them, a continuity of ceremony that links generations. When Queen Elizabeth II passed in 2022, the nation stood still once more. Crowds lined the streets not out of duty, but out of gratitude. Her 70 years on the throne had been the quiet thread through decades of transformation, a living bridge between the empire that was and the world that is. In her absence, Britain felt its history pause, then turn its page. Today, the Isles face new uncertainties: economic, political, and environmental. The unity forged by war and empire has given way to questions of identity. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, each with its voice, each with its memory. Brexit redrew the nation's lines once more, reminding the world that even the oldest unions can shift. And yet, through debate and difference, something steady remains. It is not grandeur, nor empire, nor even wealth. It is endurance, that quiet, stubborn resilience that has carried the island through every storm. On a misty morning, if you stand by the cliffs of Dover and listen to the wind, you can almost hear that endurance speak, the voice of centuries layered in the sound of the sea. It whispers of invasions turned into neighbors, of wars turned into lessons, of ruins turned into gardens. It reminds you that history is not something left behind, but something carried forward, in words, in customs, in care. The Britain of today is not the empire of yesterday. It is smaller, humbler, and infinitely more human. It measures its strength, not in colonies or armies, but in culture, science, and the compassion of its people. Its power lies in its ideas: democracy, justice, fairness, the fragile but enduring values that took root in the soil of struggle. You can see those ideas in the classrooms where children of every background learn side by side. You can hear them in the debates of Parliament, still echoing the centuries-old argument between authority and conscience. You can feel them in the silence of remembrance each November, when a nation stops for 2 minutes to honor those who fell, not for conquest, but for endurance. In every generation, Britain has faced decline, and in every generation it has found renewal. From empire to industry, from war to peace, from isolation to connection, it has reinvented itself, not by forgetting but by remembering differently. Perhaps that is the island's truest gift, not greatness, but continuity. Not the power to rule, but the wisdom to endure. The same rain that once fell on Saxon fields now drifts softly over modern cities. The same sea that carried Roman galleys now carries ferries and wind turbines. The same instinct to rebuild, to begin again, still stirs in the hearts of its people. The story of Great Britain is not finished. It never was. It moves like the tide, withdrawing, returning, reshaping the shore with every generation. If you look closely, you can see the echoes of all that came before. The Romans in the roads, The Normans in the stone, the Victorians in the railways, the dreamers of every age in the lights that burned each night across the hills and harbors. Each one left something behind, not perfection, but presence. And as the wind moves through the fields of Kent or the glens of Scotland, through the narrow lanes of York or the busy streets of London, it carries the same quiet promise it always has, that no matter how the world changes, the island endures. Its story is not one of unbroken triumph, but of unbroken spirit. A spirit that bends, but does not break. A spirit that remembers, rebuilds, and keeps walking forward through fog and sunlight alike. And so, as this long journey through history comes to rest, we return to where it began, an island in the northern sea, shaped by time, watched by stars, forever learning, forever alive. This is Great Britain, a land of memory, of continuity, and of quiet, enduring grace.